Watch her face. Go back and watch it right now if you have access to the clip. The very first moment Darcey Silva ever appeared on 90 Day Fiancé. Not a highlight, not a compilation, the actual first moment. Because there is something in that specific frame that you will never be able to unsee once you understand what you are actually looking at. There is a quality to her eyes in that moment, a particular kind of openness, a hope that has not yet learned to manage itself for the camera, a vulnerability that is completely undefended because she does not yet know that vulnerability on a reality television set is not protected. It is harvested. She walked into that first scene as a private person, and a former producer just revealed in a recorded conversation with documentation that a journalist has independently verified exactly what the people behind those cameras already knew about her before she ever said a single word. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome to the Tell All Tapes. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what we cover here goes places the official narrative never does. And this particular story is one of the most important things we have ever put together. Subscribe. You will want to be here for what comes next, because what comes next is the part that reframes everything. The producer's account, and we are going to go through it in detail, step by step, because the details are where the full weight of this lands. Does not describe a television show that found an interesting person and pointed cameras at her. It describes something far more calculated than that. It describes a system, a documented, repeatable, commercially validated system for identifying specific types of people with specific emotional profiles, placing them in specific constructed situations, and converting the genuine human responses that those situations generate into quarterly revenue for a network. And Darcey Silva, according to this producer's account, was not a discovery. She was a selection. The most complete, highest scoring expression of a formula that had been developed and refined across multiple seasons before she ever filled out an application. Let that land for a second, because it matters that you feel the full weight of what that means before we go any further. This was not a story about a woman looking for love on television. This was a story about a production company that needed a specific kind of woman, one with a very particular emotional architecture, and went looking until they found the best available version of her. And then told her across a decade of filming that the cameras were there because her story was compelling, which was true. But the reason her story was compelling had been documented in a file before she arrived, and that file had numbers in it, numbers next to her name, scores, criteria, a ranked assessment of how completely she embodied what the production needed her to embody. The journalist who received this account has the documentation. The producer kept records, and the records describe a casting process that the network has never publicly acknowledged and almost certainly does not want described in the specific terms that are now in a journalist's possession. Here is why the casting process is the place where this entire story begins, because understanding it changes the frame on everything that came after. Reality television presents itself to its audience through a very specific implicit promise. The promise is this: these are real people in real situations, and you are watching what actually happened. The drama is real. The heartbreak is real. The choices are real. The production found these people, not made them. And that promise is the foundation on which the audience's emotional investment is built. You care about Darcy because you believe you are watching a real woman make real choices in real circumstances. The moment the promise breaks, the moment you understand that the woman was selected because her choices were predictable, that the circumstances were constructed to produce specific emotional responses, that what you are watching was engineered rather than discovered, the entire architecture of your investment changes. And yet, here is the complication that this producer's account makes impossible to ignore. The scoring document does not say Darcy was performing. It does not say she was acting. It does not say her emotions were manufactured or her vulnerability was calculated. The criteria that the document used to rank her were not criteria for performance. They were criteria for authenticity, for genuine emotional expressiveness, for real vulnerability that could not be duped by a professional actress because an audience, after enough exposure, can feel the difference between performed pain and actual pain. Darcy scored highest on those criteria because she was the most genuinely, measurably, documentably real person who applied. The scoring document is not evidence that her decade on television was best. It is evidence of the precise opposite. It is evidence that she was selected because she was real, and that a production system took her realness, put it in a commercial container, and extracted value from it across 10 years while she experienced the costs. That is the thing that sits in the chest when you fully understand it. Now let's talk about how the casting architecture actually worked, because the former producer's description of it is specific enough that it moves out of the realm of speculation and into the realm of something you can actually examine. The process the producer describes is called, in internal production language, emotional profile targeting. It is not unique to this franchise. Versions of it exist across reality television formats, but the 90 Day franchise developed and refined a particularly sophisticated version of it because the format has a built-in dramatic engine that requires specific fuel. The engine is this: a person who has committed to a cross-cultural romantic relationship with someone they met online, who has real emotional stakes in the outcome, and who will be filming the development of that relationship in real time. For that engine to produce the kind of dramatic content that generates the ratings and the social media engagement and the audience investment that keeps a franchise alive across multiple spin-offs and a decade of programming, for that engine to work, the person at the center of it needs to have specific characteristics. They need to be a romantic idealist. Not performatively, actually. The kind of person for whom love is not just one component of a satisfying life, but the organizing principle of it, the thing that gives the rest of the narrative its meaning. Because without genuine romantic idealism, the commitment to a cross-cultural relationship with someone met online reads as foolishness, and the audience cannot find the emotional entry point that makes them care. They need to be externally oriented for validation. Again, not as a performance choice, actually wired that way. Because the format requires them to share their emotional processing publicly, in confessional settings, on camera, with strangers, and a person with a deeply private internal life will not give the camera what it needs. The external validation orientation is not a flaw the production exploits. It is a requirement the production selects for, because without it, the confessional goes flat and the audience loses the access that generates the connection that drives the ratings. They need to have a backstory with enough prior heartbreak to provide narrative depth. Not because trauma is required, though the producer's account is honest about the fact that some level of prior pain tends to correlate with the other criteria in ways that the selection process found useful. But because a story about someone who has never been hurt falling in love is a story with no stakes, the audience needs to understand what the person has already lost in order to care about what they might lose again. And they need what the producer called in the recorded conversation emotional generosity with the camera, the willingness to share vulnerability without the protective deflection that most people deploy when they become aware that they are being observed. The ability, and it is genuinely an ability, not a weakness, to remain emotionally open in a filming environment that most people find alienating, reductive, and threatening. Because without that quality, the entire format collapses. The camera needs access to real feelings. And most people, when they understand what cameras do with real feeling, close the door. Darcey scored highest on all 4 criteria, not slightly higher. The producer in the recorded account used specific language about the scoring. She described Darcey's profile as the cleanest expression of the target characteristics they had encountered in multiple casting cycles. And when you look at what happened across the decade that followed, when you review the narrative arc, the relationships, the public moments, the social media presence, the spin-off series, all of it, that assessment reads as accurate. She did not just meet the criteria, she embodied them so completely that she became, in a sense, the franchise's definitive expression of the character type the criteria were designed to find. Which brings us to the question that the producer's account makes unavoidable. And it is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. What does a decade of having your most pronounced characteristics commercially rewarded do to those characteristics? Because here is what the production environment created once Darcey was inside it. Every time the romantic idealism drove a decision that generated dramatic content, every time she committed deeply and quickly in ways that the audience found both compelling and, if we are being honest, at times difficult to watch, the production rewarded that idealism with more camera time, more narrative focus, more of the validation that the external orientation was always seeking. Every time the emotional generosity with the camera produced a confessional moment that resonated with audiences, every time she shared something raw and unmanaged and genuinely felt in a way that made viewers stop scrolling and actually feel something, that generosity was rewarded with audience connection, with engagement, with the specific kind of public love that the external validation dependency had always been searching for. The production did not just select her characteristics, it built a feedback system around them. A system that said, consistently and over years, that the characteristics that were causing her pain in her private life, the idealism that kept leading her into situations where she was going to get hurt, the validation dependency that made her vulnerable to certain kinds of manipulation, those characteristics were also the source of her value, her relevance, her connection to an audience that genuinely loved her, not a manufactured love, real love, of the kind that audiences develop for people they have watched, is vulnerable across a decade. But love was, at its origin point, a commercial product. And here is where the character dimension of this revelation becomes something we have to handle very carefully, because it is not simple, and it would be dishonest to present it as simple. Darcey Silva is a real person. The woman in the scoring document is a real woman. The pain she experienced across that decade was real pain. The relationships she invested in were genuinely invested in. The hope she brought to each new situation was not a performance of hope. It was hope. And the fact that a production system identified that hope as commercially valuable before she arrived, and then built an environment designed to keep it present and visible and generating content. The fact that the architecture surrounds the person rather than the person being separate from it does not make the experience of it less real from the inside. But it does mean that the story she has been telling herself about her decade on television and the story her audience has been told is incomplete in a way that matters. Because the story she was told was, this is your journey. These are your choices. This is your growth, your heartbreak, your resilience, your story. And that story is true. All of those things happened, but they happened inside a container that was designed before she arrived, maintained around her across 10 years, and optimized on an ongoing basis to extract the maximum commercial value from the specific emotional characteristics that the scoring document identified on day one. She was real inside a constructed architecture. And she was never fully told about the architecture. That is the revelation. And it is not a revelation that can be undone once it enters the room. Now let's talk about what this means for the franchise, because the institutional stakes here are separate from the personal stakes and significantly larger in financial terms. The 90-day franchise is currently in active expansion. New formats are in production, new casting cycles are underway, new markets are being developed. The entire business model of that expansion rests on the premise, the implicit, never explicitly stated, absolutely essential premise that the people being filmed are real people in real situations who were found organically, not engineered systematically. That premise is the load-bearing wall of the franchise's credibility. And a former producer with documentation describing a systematic emotional profile targeting process in specific enough terms that a journalist could verify the account and sit on it only until the legal review was complete, that is not a crack in the wall. That is a challenge to the foundation. The network's legal team is not currently asking what this means for Darcey Silva specifically. Darcy is a talent question. The talent question is manageable. The franchise question is different. The franchise question is, if this account is published with the documentation attached, and if the documentation is specific and credible enough that other participants in the casting process can confirm or deny the specifics, what is the downstream effect on the audience's relationship with every current and future season? Because the audience's emotional investment in the format depends on the promise. And if the promise is demonstrably, documentably, systematically broken, not by one rogue producer making one bad decision, but by a designed and repeated process, the investment changes. That is why the resources being directed at this situation are significantly larger than anything that has been directed at any previous controversy involving a cast member. This is not a talent management situation. This is a franchise protection situation. And the difference between those two categories is measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars that the franchise generates annually. The former producer who made the decision to describe the architecture, who kept the records, who participated in the recorded conversation, who has apparently concluded that the description is more important now than the protection of the system she was part of. That decision was not made lightly. People who have been inside production systems at this level understand exactly what they're releasing when they release this kind of account. They understand the legal exposure. They understand the professional consequences. They understand the institutional response that will be organized against their credibility. And they release it anyway, which means the question worth asking is, what does someone know or feel or have experienced that tips the calculation in the direction of description rather than silence? What is it that makes a person who has been inside an architecture, who participated in the scoring process, who was in the room where the criteria were developed, who watched the selection happen and watched the subsequent decade of content that the selection produced, decide that the architecture deserves to be described publicly with documentation in a format that cannot be retracted? That is not a question with a knowable answer from the outside. But it is a question worth holding because the answer to it is almost certainly connected to something more personal than strategic. People do not blow up professional relationships and legal exposure for tactical reasons. They do it because something they saw or participated in accumulated to a weight that silence could no longer hold. And now let's come back to Darcy, because the personal dimension of this is the one that matters most to this channel, and most to the audience that has followed her story. Think about what it means to receive this information. Not to learn about it from a YouTube channel or read about it in a journalist's account, but to be the person whose name is on the scoring document. To see, for the first time, the criteria by which you were selected, your emotional characteristics listed and scored and ranked as if they were specifications for a component that a production needed to complete a machine. To understand, looking at that document, that the decade you experienced as your own story, your choices, your growth, your heartbreak, your public self was also simultaneously, from the beginning, the output of a system that selected you because your particular version of realness was commercially optimized for the format. Your choices were real. Your feelings were real. The love was real, and so was the pain. But the frame around all of it was constructed before you arrived, and you were never shown the blueprint. That is a specific and disorienting kind of information to receive about your own life. It does not invalidate the experience. It does not mean the feelings were wrong, or the choices were mistakes, or the relationships were not genuinely entered into. But it means that the story you have been telling yourself, the organizing narrative of your public decade, needs to be rebuilt around a structural element you did not previously know was there. And that rebuilding is private work, genuinely private work, the kind that cannot happen in a confessional, cannot happen in a social media post, cannot happen in a response to a camera. For the first time in 10 years, the most significant thing happening in Darcey Silva's life is something that cannot be content. And here is the specific irony that I want to sit with, because it is the most revealing thing about the architecture that the producer's account describes. The characteristics that the scoring document identified, the emotional generosity, the external validation orientation, the camera vulnerability, are the same characteristics that will shape her response to learning about the scoring document. She will respond emotionally because she is emotionally generous. She will seek validation from her audience because that is how she processes difficult things. She will be open with the camera because the camera has been her primary relationship with public expression for a decade. And that relationship does not get restructured overnight just because you have received new information about how it was established. And in responding that way and being precisely and completely the person that the scoring document identified, she will be providing the most thorough confirmation possible that the profile was accurate. the response will validate the architecture it is responding to. There is no position she can take that is outside the loop. Understanding the loop does not automatically provide an exit from it. That is not a criticism. It is an observation about what a decade of commercially reinforced behavioral patterns does to a person. The characteristics that were there when she walked in have been amplified, sustained, and made more entrenched by 10 years of an environment that rewarded their fullest expression. She is not the same person who walked into that first scene. She is a more complete version of what the scoring document identified, because the architecture she has been inside has spent a decade completing her in precisely the direction the formula required. Now, I want to say something directly to everyone who is watching this, and I want to include this channel in what I am about to say, because honesty requires it. We all participated in this architecture. Every person who ever watched a Darcey episode, every person who shared a clip, posted a reaction, wrote a comment that said some version of, "I cannot believe she did that again." Every person who followed her journey and felt genuine investment in it and experienced genuine emotion watching it unfold. We were the mechanism. The production selected the input, Darcey's genuine emotional life, and we were the mechanism by which that input was converted into commercial value. Our engagement was revenue. Our attention was the product. Our genuine feeling for a genuine person was the return on the investment that the scoring document represented. That does not make our feelings less real. It does not mean we were wrong to care, but it means that the architecture was larger than the television screen, and we were inside it too. Every view extended the container that Darcey was living in. Every engagement signal told the production that the formula was working and should continue. We loved her, in whatever version of that word applies to an audience's relationship with someone they have only ever watched. And that love was simultaneously a commercial transaction that we were not fully informed about either. The hypocrisy the production relied on was not just the hypocrisy of the people who built the architecture. It was the hypocrisy of everyone who benefited from the genuine feeling without asking what it cost the person whose genuineness made the whole thing work. 31 episodes into this series. That feels like the right moment to say that out loud. Because here is what the scoring document ultimately represents. When you strip away the industry language and the commercial framework and look at what it actually describes. It describes a person whose most essential qualities, the openness, the love, the willingness to keep hoping even after being hurt, the inability to stop giving the camera and the world the full, unguarded version of herself, were identified as valuable before she arrived, were selected for, were placed in a system that needed them to remain as they were, as pronounced as they were, as commercially productive as they were. And then, when the system had extracted a decade of content from those qualities, the system did not change. The person absorbed the costs while the institution collected the returns. The scoring document is not evidence of cruelty. None of the people inside the architecture were necessarily cruel. The producer who kept the records was inside a system too. The network that commissioned the casting process was responding to market pressures that are real and ongoing and not invented as an excuse. The audience that provided the engagement that validated the formula was doing what audiences do when they are given access to genuine human feeling, which is to feel something in return. No single person in this story is the villain. The architecture is the story. And the architecture was designed to be invisible to feel from every position inside it like something other than what it was. The producer decided that being invisible is no longer acceptable, and now the scoring document exists in a journalist's possession, with numbers next to Darcey's name, with criteria spelled out in production language that is precise and verifiable and not subject to the kinds of reinterpretation that vaguer accounts allow. The document exists. The account exists. The documentation exists. And the franchise that was built on the promise that these are real people in real situations that were found and not engineered is now facing the specific, documented, credibly sourced challenge to that promise that it has spent a decade hoping would never arrive. Darcey Silva, who has said across 10 years of cameras and confessionals and social media and the full relentless visibility of being a public person in the reality television era, Darcey Silva, who has always maintained that what you see is what you get, is now looking at a document that says what you were is what we needed. And learning for the first time that those two things, what you are and what a production system needs you to be, were not the same thing. Were never the same thing. Were in fact precisely distinct in a way that the architecture was designed to prevent her from seeing. The distinction between them is the most important thing this channel has ever tried to bring into the light. The scoring document is not the end of Darcey's story. If anything, it is the beginning of the most honest chapter of it, because it is the first chapter she will be able to write with full information. The first time she will be able to look at her own decade with the structural diagram in her hand. The first time she will be able to decide, with actual knowledge of what the architecture was, what she wants her relationship to public life to look like going forward. That is not a small thing. That is, potentially, everything. But it requires private work that the camera cannot witness. The rebuilding of the internal narrative that every person has to do when they receive structural information about the environment in which their story has been unfolding. The work that is genuinely hers, not a production's, not an audience's, not a franchise's. The work that is done without a camera in the room and without a confessional at the end of the day. That work is beginning right now, in private, in the space that the scoring document and the producer's recorded account have forced open. And what comes out of it is that Darcey Silva is on the other side of genuinely understanding the architecture she was inside. That story is the one that no production system designed before she arrived. That story is actually, for the first time, entirely hers. Subscribe to the Tell All Tapes, because we will be here when that story starts to be told.